Hi there, this is Lucas Leuting again. I'm a scenarios and policy researcher at the CGIAR research program on climate change, agriculture, and food security, and also at Utrecht University in the Netherlands. This is the second LSIL mini lecture on scenarios. This time we're focusing on how to develop them, scenarios, and later on in the same mini lecture on how to use them for policy formulation. And that's going to be the second and final part of this mini lecture. Let's start with a little recap of what scenarios are. This is explained in more detail in the first of the scenario mini lectures, webinars, whatever you want to call them. It's important to understand that scenarios are multiple what-if stories about the future, and we use them to explore different plausible directions of change, as we cannot predict the future in all its complexity. So scenarios are not predictions. That's important to remember. They are a tool for testing policies, plans, or strategies. This lecture is focusing on the development of scenarios and later on the use. This slide shows a couple of key considerations and questions when developing scenarios. It is important, first of all, to involve key policymakers and other key stakeholders in this process of developing scenarios, because their knowledge, as well as their perspectives, is what matters most. Next, a couple of questions should be asked. What are the key factors of change? For example, in markets, in socioeconomic development, climate change, etc. And how uncertain are these factors of change for agriculture and food security? Or in our case of the LSIL research project for the livestock sector specifically. And also, what different directions may these drivers take? When developing scenarios, we look at different combinations of factors of change or drivers and the directions they may take in the future. And we're talking about a timeline of several decades here. That's typically the timeline scenarios span. The most diverse scenarios are selected and then later on used to test policies in the widely different conditions of these different scenarios. And how that's done will be explained later in this mini lecture. There are different ways to construct scenarios. Here we focus on the two-axis method, in which we combine two of the most uncertain and impactful drivers. But there are numerous other ways to do this, for example, with three structuring drivers, as this picture shows. But we're focusing on this two-axis method. So how does that work? We can distinguish four different steps in the development process of scenarios. We start by identifying relevant drivers or factors of change. Then secondly, we will select from all these identified drivers two structuring drivers, which will form the two axes which structure the four scenarios that we will work with. Then thirdly, we are going to frame the drivers, and fourthly, we are going to actually develop the scenarios. So the first step is identifying relevant drivers. How do we do that? We do that with a lot of participants, of course, and as I mentioned earlier on one of the earlier slides, we try to involve as many stakeholders as possible, so people from the government, policymakers, but it's also very important to involve people from the private sector, civil society, NGOs, and researchers, academia. So the question to be asked is then, what are the main drivers of change concerning the future in general, and more specifically in terms of climate change, agriculture, food security, etc. And when brainstorming about relevant drivers, it's important to think of different categories, as this picture shows all these different categories of drivers also influence and interact with each other. And those 5 categories are broadly culture, norms and values, politics and institutions, socioeconomic aspects and demographics, ecology and natural resources, and science and technology, because they all play a role as it comes to the future of, in our case, livestock systems. The second step is the selection of structuring drivers. And what we mean by structuring drivers is the 2 drivers that will form the axis that will lead to 4 scenarios, as you can see in the visualization on the right. And 2 questions are key here. Which drivers are the most impactful? And secondly, which drivers are most uncertain? Why that second one? Well, for example, if we look at a driver like population growth, well, it's very likely to have a huge impact in the near future, in the coming decade. But is this also an uncertain driver? Well, I beg to differ, because it's highly unlikely to see a population decline in many areas of the world in the coming decade. So that's not really a driver we want to choose as a structuring driver, because it can go either one way or the other. We want a driver that can go either one way or the other. For example, political stability in the region of East Africa. Is East Africa going to be politically stable? Is there going to be a lot of collaboration between the states, the nations in East Africa? Or is there going to be rivalry, maybe even conflict? We don't know. So that's a very uncertain driver. Then the third step in the development of scenarios is the framing of the drivers. Once we have chosen a driver, we can think of different ways to frame them. There are different possible states of drivers. And we can illustrate this by this example. How can we define a driver in international politics and legislation, for example? Well, a way to frame this driver is oriented towards economic growth on the one hand, versus environment oriented on the other hand. Very different. It can go either way. So that's one way to frame this driver. When international trades focus primarily on economic growth, one can imagine that cutting carbon emissions is not the main priority, for example, and on the other hand, of the spectrum, a world where environmental issues are an important focus in international legislation would probably lead to strict rules on carbon emissions. But there are numerous other ways to frame this driver. Another example might be to frame this driver in terms of international collaboration versus international rivalries or distrust. I hope this is clear. And that's really a discussion among the participants, which is very important to define the different drivers that will structure the scenarios. And then the fourth and final step of the development phase is the development of the actual scenarios. So this is usually done by first discussing the outline of each of the 4 scenarios that are formed by the structuring drives, the structuring axis. So what does the combination of these driver states mean in general? What kind of world would this be? And once we have this general outline, this general picture of the scenario, we can start develop narratives for each of the different future scenarios. And for the development of the scenario narratives, it is important to look at all the drivers and factors of change that were identified during step 1. So that was the brainstorm of all relevant drivers and factors of change. Because they all play a role in each of the scenarios in different ways. So it's not only the structuring drivers that we use for the narrative development, but all the drivers. Scenarios are basically stories, and that storytelling aspect of scenarios ensures plausibility as well. That's also a nice advantage of scenarios. So that brings me at the second part of this mini lecture. So once we have developed scenarios, that's all nice, of course, but we also want to use them, put them to use. And how do we use them? That's the focus of this second part. Well, in our case, we use them to test and improve policies. So we can think of a number of metaphors which describe how we use scenarios. So we use scenarios as challenging, plausible futures, and one of the metaphors that we can use to describe this process is that we use scenarios as crash tests. Another one is we can use them as wind tunnels or obstacle courses. And the picture to the right, it's one I randomly bumped into on the internet, but I think it's also a very nice metaphor for scenarios and how we use them. A smooth sea never made a skilled sailor. Think of the sailor as the policy, a skilled sailor of a very robust and good policy. If we test it only against a very well, non-challenging future, a smooth sea, the policy won't be very robust, won't be a skilled sailor. If we test it against all kinds of challenging, plausible futures, then we get a robust policy, a skilled sailor. So if we look at the CCAF scenario guided policy review method, the typical process that we use, we can summarize it as follows. We start with a plan or policy, a draft for a new version or an old version. And well, the endpoint will be a new plan, a new robust version of the plan or policy. And how do we get there? Well, we develop scenarios, 4 scenarios most of the time, and we test the plan, the draft plan or the old plan against all of the 4 scenarios. Each of the scenarios poses specific challenges and opportunities, and this is translated into recommendations to make the policy better, and this ends up in a robust new plan. So let me illustrate this by 2 cases. First of all, Burkina Faso, in which we started a scenario-guided policy review process in close collaboration with Burkina Faso policymakers in July 2015. We looked at the Plan National du Secteur Rural, or in English, the National Plan for the Rural Sector. And the participants included people from the government, key policymakers, but also people from the private sector, civil society, and academia. Yeah, so we had a broad representation in the room there. And the results of this process were a complete reframing of the plan because of the scenarios, actually, and the new insights the scenarios gave to the policymakers over there, and also some detailed scenario-guided recommendations from each of the different scenarios. The scenarios that we used in this process were the CCAF's West Africa scenarios that were downscaled to the level of Burkina Faso and reimagined to really fit the context of the specific country, Burkina Faso. Here you see the 4 scenarios that were used, and the structuring axes here are short-term priorities versus long-term priorities, and change driven mainly by state actors or by non-state actors. And the whole logic behind these scenarios can be found in our CCAF's West Africa scenarios working paper, for which you see a link here. The slides will be put up at an ELSO website as well, so you can access this website later if you're interested. In this process, the scenario logic led to recommendations, as these examples show. So, for example, the first one, a recommendation was to secure rights of smallholders, tenure, access to quality inputs, equipment, etc. And how did we end up with this recommendation? Well, in the cash, calories, and control scenario, one of the 4 scenarios that you can read in the scenarios working paper, in this scenario, big agribusinesses focusing on high-value cash crops for export are dominant, leading to smallholder farmers to lose land. As a consequence, conflict over land access and use arise. Well, this led to this recommendation, and I included a couple of other examples here as well, which you can read over when you have the time. Another case I want to show you is the case of Ghana, in which we looked at the national livestock policy in July 2016. And here I want to show this example in which we translated a recommendation into a concrete policy element. So what you can see here, the recommendation was the government should form partnerships with private sector actors to fund agricultural extension programs with the appropriate policy environment. Additionally, the policy should promote e-extension. Furthermore, extension should incorporate education on livestock health for communities. And this was directly translated into a policy guideline, as you can see here, and also some extra strategies. This is just to illustrate how it works in practice. And I hope this was a very clear presentation. And if you have questions, you can always contact me via my email address that's showed on the intro slide of this one. Happy to discuss and answer your questions. Thanks a lot. See you next time.